Louise Sellers was a 16-year-old teenager who lived in Wigan. She was a student at Shelvington High School, a popular, pretty girl with blonde hair and blue eyes, who still lived with her parents at their home in Wigan. Louise loved to dance with her friends. She loved music and makeup, as a lot of teenagers do. She was a fun-loving girl and was doing very well at school, with plans to go to college and become a PE teacher. Louise was described as a bubbly girl, someone who was everybody's friend.
Louise was an absolutely fun-loving girl. She loved to go out with her mates. She loved to have a dance on a Friday night. She was doing really well at school. She had her life planned out to be a PE teacher. She was going to college. She had everything set.
So I just need to make note that in this case there are varying dates on which this girl died. So what we're going to do is we're going to go with the date that the Crime Watch reconstruction has on their screen, as they are probably more accurate, as that dates back to 95. Now that afternoon, August the 3rd, 1995, Louise was at home with her parents. Her mother was not feeling too good, so she went upstairs to have a lie down, while her father was downstairs watching TV. And Louise and her father were looking through a mail order catalogue together. Before Louise's mother went upstairs to sleep, she had asked Louise if she was planning on going out that evening. But at that point, Louise had not made any plans. Her mother told her to be safe and not to be on the telephone all night, and then she went up to bed. Louise called a friend and asked her if she wanted to meet up that evening. Louise told her friend that she had loads to tell her, and the pair arranged to meet outside a late shop at 6:30 p.m. Louise's friend wanted to know all of the gossip over the phone, but Louise was sat with her dad and she wanted her to wait until they met up. A little later, after dinner, Louise asked her dad if she thought Mum would still be asleep, and he told her that she probably would be, but why? Louise wanted some money to take with her when she went out, but her father told her not to wake her mother up. Louise didn't listen. Desperate for some cash, she went upstairs to ask her mother. Her mother was half asleep, but did give her £1 for a couple of cans of Coke. Louise said goodbye to her dad, grabbed her coat, and off she went down the driveway. That evening, she met up with a friend outside of the shop at 6:30 p.m. Louise told her friend about how she'd been to a local nightclub on the Friday night, and about some young men that had been stood in the queue with her. Then about a fallout she'd had with the girl she'd gone to the nightclub with. She then told her friend that she'd kissed a boy named Andrew. The boy had given Louise his ring, but she'd forgotten to give him it back, and told her friend that she was hoping to see him that night so she could give it back to him. As they sat and talked in a local bus stop, swigging from cans of Coke, at about 9:15 p.m, a white car pulled up alongside of them. Louise's friend seemed to know the man and started to get into the front passenger seat. They asked Louise to get in as they were only going over to Anne's house, but Louise told them, "Not tonight, I'm a bit tired, I think I'll go home instead." So the white car drove off with Louise's friend inside, leaving Louise stood at the side of the road. But then about 10 minutes later, Louise apparently knocked on one of her friend's doors. She told her, "You'll never guess what. I was just stood at a bus stop on Randall's Corner and a man pulls up next to me in a white car. He asked me if I wanted a lift and I told him no. He then said, 'F off, you SLAG.' At around 9:30 p.m, a lady was apparently driving along Miles Lane. She remembered seeing Louise walking up the road towards Randall's Corner. 5 minutes later, another lady recalled seeing what they thought was Louise standing at a bus stop talking to two men in a white Ford Escort. Then moments later, a couple saw a white Ford coming towards them. But it was so weird. It was as if as soon as the driver saw them, he sped off in their direction as if he didn't want to be seen. Meanwhile, Louise's parents were sat up watching TV. Her mother asked her father, "What time did you tell Louise to be in?" "It's Sunday," her father said. "She's usually in by about 10:30 on a school night." But by this point, it was nearly 11 p.m. It was unusual for Louise not to be back, and her mother recalled that if she was going to be out later, she would always ring and let them know. It was strange, as they expected her to walk through the door at any minute, but her mother felt bad calling people late at night, but I would be in bed. But when it got to after 11 with still no sign of Louise, they had to find out if anyone had seen her, and they hoped that she just might be at a friend's house. But as she called everyone she could think of, she drew a blank. She was becoming more frantic and upset. Her mother spoke to Kelly, one of Louise's friends. Remember the girl she'd met up with at the shop? Well, Kelly was still fast asleep, but her mother woke her up and asked her, what time did you see Louise? Kelly told her that she'd seen Louise about 9:20 when they'd left her at the bus stop. Her mother was left with no option but to call the police. Her father walked the streets with a torch, calling out her name. And when police came, they took details and a recent photo of Louise so that they could see what she looked like. Police circulated the description of Louise to all units, and by now police were driving the streets looking for her. But her mother knew something was terribly wrong, with still no sign of Louise. But then, the morning after Louise had gone missing, a retired police officer out having his morning stroll near Billinge found the body of a young girl. It was only 5 miles from her home, and it was Louise Sellers, but at this time they didn't know that. Police quickly began to assess the scene. A killer was now on the loose, and it looked as though Louise had been strangled. She had been found battered and strangled to death in the fields behind Billinge Hospital. Louise had been attacked around a kind of Lover's Lane area behind the maternity hospital, and her body had been left without much effort to conceal it. At the scene of the murder, the forensics found several vital pieces of evidence. They found several used cigarette butts, a strange car tire impression in the dirt, a footprint on her abdomen, and arrived at Louise's house to give them the terrible news. They interviewed Louise's friends and family, neighbours, anyone who she'd spoken to or seen that night, anyone who'd seen anything suspicious. Police were now trying to piece together Louise's final hours. With the help of Louise's friends and locals who saw her that night, they were able to build up a picture of her movements until around 9:30, when things seemed to dry up. A man came forward. He said that he'd seen something strange that night. Whilst hanging out with friends, a car coming towards him on the opposite side of the road stopped, turned around and went back at high speed up Miles Lane. But the important info that it was only a short distance from Louise's house. Was Louise in the car? It was apparently an RS Turbo white Fiesta, and there were not many of those in the area at the time. A similar car to the one seen was owned by a local man, 21-year-old lorry driver Darren Ashurst. Police looked into his background. He was apparently described as a bit of a loner. He could have a sharp temper and liked to tell tall stories. They spoke to his ex-girlfriends. One had a diary seized after she said that he'd attacked her. One ex said that he tried to run her over, and someone else said that he was seen angrily punching in his car windows. When police interviewed Darren, he said that he did know Louise and had given her lifts several times. He then even said that he'd seen her that night, but did say that he did not pick her up. Now, apart from a few minor driving infringements, Darren Ashurst did not have a massive criminal history. And when police spoke to Louise's friends and family, they were all giving conflicting stories as to exactly how well Louise knew Darren. And when police asked about his alibi for that night, he said that he'd driven over to his sister's house, but this did not check out. And when police finally spoke to his family regarding his whereabouts that night, it was told that he was supposed to be picking up his girlfriend but failed to show up. She apparently rang his home address many times during that evening, but only managed to get hold of him after 11 p.m. And as police traced him around town that night using CCTV and looking into his bank records, they were able to see that Darren had taken his car to the Crow Orchard petrol station for a full deep clean and vac at 10:50 p.m. that night. The finger of suspicion for the murder of Louise Sellers was now fully on young Appleby Bridge man Darren Ashurst, who had apparently been acting oddly the night of the killing and thereafter. That evening, he had apparently taken 2 showers, one when he had got home from work, and the other when he'd got in that night. Police examined his car tyres. Apparently, the tyre tracks did look similar to the ones found at the crime scene. Further witnesses came forward, including a woman who had recognised the rope that had been used to strangle Louise. It was described as being one that had last been seen in Darren Ashurst's possession. And two men came forward to say that Darren had asked them not long after the murder whether they knew anyone that could either steal or burn his car. Not long after the killing, he was seen removing the stickers from the side of his car to change its appearance and removed the carpet from the boot. As much evidence as police felt they had on Ashurst, it was all circumstantial evidence, and they were missing that key piece of forensic evidence to place him firmly at the scene. The case went cold, and it seemed that the person responsible for Louise Sellers' death would never be caught or prosecuted. And over the next few years, officers continued to follow up leads and look at the possibility of any forensic evidence being taken from the items recovered at the scene. Then, Detective Ian Seabridge took over Wigan CID, and it was his mission to crack open some of these older cases. He had an excellent track record, and it came out that two of Darren Ashurst's friends had been asked if they would give him an alibi for that night. The key piece of evidence was the cigarette butts found at the scene. They were freshly smoked when dropped, but back in 1995 DNA was in its infancy and it was not advanced enough to come up with a DNA profile. But by 1999 they were able to recover a DNA profile from one of those cigarette butts that had a 1 in 83 million chance that the cigarette had not been smoked by Darren Ashurst. So on the 26th of January 2000, Darren Ashurst was finally arrested on suspicion of murdering Louise Sellers. Darren Ashurst thought he had escaped justice because forensic tests in 1995 were unable to prove that he had been the killer of Louise Sellers. But police were convinced of his guilt all the way along. But on November the 1st, in the year 2000, after 27 hours of deliberations, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Darren Ashurst stood impassively as Mrs. Justice Rafferty told him he had snuffed out the life of a girl who had everything to live for. The pathologist who examined her body had never seen such injuries. The judge said, "How and why she suffered, you have chosen not to explain." Apparently the schoolgirl had gone out with Darren Ashurst months before her murder, but the relationship had cooled and Louise had met someone else. He was given a life sentence for beating and strangling Louise. The tragedy left a devastating effect on her family, leading first to her mum and adoptive father Gary to split. It was reported that in November 2017, Darren had been moved to a lower category prison and was allowed an escorted town visit and had applied for parole. Her mother revealed that she attended the parole hearing for his impending release, and although she and Darren did not come face to face, there will now be an agonising wait before discovering whether his bid for freedom was successful or not. Her mother said, "Not only did Darren Ashurst deem to take the life of my beautiful daughter, our firstborn child, he changed our lives forever. He ruined our family. My successful husband and partner of 20 years became a shell of his former self, taking to drink and prescription substances as his only comfort, which ultimately led to their divorce and to his ultimate destruction by taking his own life. My two children have had to deal with not only their sister, who was both adored, being taken away from them, but then their father as well. My son, who was 10 at the time of Louise's death, went from being a bubbly, fun-loving, extroverted child to a child who is an introvert, sullen, wanting to fight the world. His heart was broken. My youngest was only 2 years of age at the time. Myself, a piece of me died when Louise did. There is nothing worse in life than losing a child, but especially when your beautiful child had her whole life ahead of her. She was healthy, happy, and passionate about horses, and she was a successful show jumper. She was predicted A stars in all of her exams and looking forward to becoming a PE teacher. She was loved by everyone she met. To see Louise leave the house that afternoon with a smile and the flick of her hair, saying, "See you later, I won't be late," and never being seen again, because Darren Ashurst decided by his hand it would be Louise's last day on this earth. He said, "We hear Darren had been a model prisoner. Does this guarantee that he is a model citizen if released, as he has never admitted his guilt or shown an ounce of remorse for what he did? We are willing to gamble and let him outside into the world again and hope that society will be safe. Whose child will it be next? Has his sinister and calculated behaviour really changed?" "The most troubling thing to me," she said, "is that we still have the why question out there. He had the choice, and he chose to murder my child." Detectives did conclude that Louise had put up a brave fight, but had been ferociously beaten, stamped on and strangled in a frenzied attack, only 500 yards from the hospital. Darren Ashurst has continued to maintain his innocence throughout the whole of his trial and imprisonment.